The sound of forged steel dragging across poured concrete carries a distinct resonance. At 2 a.m. in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, the crisp mountain air amplified that noise, turning a simple scrape into a siren. I stood in the unlit entryway of my home, a mug of lukewarm chamomile tea in one hand and my phone in the other. Through the viewfinder of my camera, the composition outside my window was almost cinematic. A flatbed tow truck idled under the amber glow of a street lamp, diesel exhaust pluming into the dark sky. 2 figures scrambled near the front bumper of my rusted 1974 Ford F-250. The first was Ryan, wearing a tailored puffer jacket that caught the ambient light as he leaned over the grill. The second was Vanessa, my younger sister. She struggled with the heavy winch chain, her manicured hands slipping against the greasy metal. Her designer boots lost traction on the frost-coated asphalt. She caught her balance against the truck's rusted quarter panel, leaving a clean streak in decades of accumulated grime. They were risking a felony to steal what they had previously called worthless junk. My name is Natalie Gonzalez. I was 32 years old the night I watched my own flesh and blood try to repossess a punchline. They thought the Ford was just a decaying shell. When our father's estate was divided weeks prior, Vanessa walked away with the house, 40 acres of pristine timberland, and $400,000 in cash. They handed me the rusted key to this truck as a joke. I accepted it without a word. But here is what they did not know. What was hidden beneath the rotting floorboards, and what I had already done to ensure the real inheritance would never touch their hands. Welcome back to Pan of Vengeance, where quiet truth dismantles loud entitlement. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, handed the scraps while someone else took the feast, you are in the right place. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. 3 weeks earlier, the air in my mother's living room smelled like artificial lemon polish and rehearsed sympathy. Diane, my mother, sat next to my stepfather Greg on their pristine white sofa. Vanessa sat across from me in a leather armchair, twisting a diamond engagement ring around her finger. The estate lawyer had just finished reading the final addendums of my biological father's will. The division of assets was not a surprise. It was a confirmation of a hierarchy established long ago. Vanessa was the future. That was the unspoken rule of our household. She received the 4-bedroom property. She received the deed to the timberland. The cash accounts were transferred directly into her name. I sat in a wooden chair near the hallway, my hands folded in my lap, listening to the itemized list of my sister's new empire. Then the lawyer cleared his throat, slid a manila envelope across the mahogany coffee table, and excused himself. Vanessa leaned forward, her jewelry clinking against the glass tabletop. She tipped the envelope upside down. A single, jagged brass key dropped onto the wood. She picked it up between 2 fingers, holding it like a dirty napkin, and tossed it into my lap. It landed on my jeans with a dull thud. "You can have his junk truck," she said. A small, tight smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Mom and Greg think it is only fair." Diane shifted on the sofa, resting her hand on Greg's knee. She lowered her voice into that soothing, practiced register she used when she wanted to sound generous while doing something cruel. "Your sister has a lot of expenses coming up with the wedding, Natalie. You are so independent. You do not need us hovering. You can just sell the scrap metal to cover the tow fee." She said the word independent like a compliment, but what she meant was I was not worth the investment. Greg did not look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on a framed painting on the far wall, silently endorsing the theft of my birthright. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or demand an explanation. I am a freelance graphic designer. My days are spent evaluating visual layouts and performing detailed modifications to digital artwork. I analyze composition, adjust background colors, substitute animal subjects in complex digital scenes, and render pristine thumbnails for high-end clients. My career requires a trained eye to spot discrepancies. I am paid to look at a messy foreground and identify the hidden structural framework holding it together. I deal in pixels, balance, and undeniable proof. My family deals in curated illusions. I picked up the rusted key. The metal was cold against my palm. "Thank you," I said. I stood up, walked out the front door into the bright afternoon sun, and drove back to my quiet life. I paid a local transport service to drag the rusted behemoth from my father's old garage to my driveway the next day. The hydraulic hiss of the flatbed echoed through my quiet neighborhood as the tow driver unhooked the F250 onto my concrete pad. He was a guy in his 50s with deep grease stains etched into the lines of his palms. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, looking at the sagging, dry-rotted tires. "This thing rides heavy for a 74, he muttered, wrapping the thick yellow toe straps around his forearm. "Suspension is bottomed out. Usually these old cabs are hollowed out by rust, but this one sits like it is hauling engine blocks in the floorboards." He noticed the weight. I noticed the geometry. After he handed me the receipt and drove away, I walked slowly around the cab. The rusted exterior was a distraction. It was a flawed top layer, masking the true asset beneath. When I pulled the handle on the driver's side door, the hinges screamed in protest. The cabin smelled like damp upholstery and stale tobacco. I leaned over the cracked vinyl bench seat and looked at the floor pan on the passenger side. To anyone else, it was just a dirty truck floor. But my eyes are trained to measure spatial relationships. The floor pan sat nearly 2 inches higher than factory specifications. The seams were hidden under a layer of brittle rubber matting, but the structural lines did not lie. The geometry was wrong. Which brings us back to 2 in the morning. I pressed my thumb against the screen of my phone, zooming in just enough to capture the numbers on Ryan's license plate. I did not bang on the window. I did not turn on the porch light. Panic and theatricality are tools for people who lack leverage. I had the leverage. The secret bolted beneath that floorboard was a puzzle my father had meticulously prepared, knowing my analytical mind would be the only thing capable of decoding it. Vanessa cursed audibly through the thin glass of my window as the heavy hook finally caught the Ford's front axle. She wiped a smudge of grease across her cheek, glancing nervously toward my dark house. She believed she was outsmarting me. She thought she was stealing back the punchline of her own joke, reclaiming the only piece of the estate she had discarded. As I watched her tighten the winch line, a quiet satisfaction settled in my chest. She was risking prison time to steal a hollow shell. She was stealing an empty truck because the true treasure was already sitting inside my secure home office, resting safely on my encrypted hard drives. But the reason my sister was out there desperate and shivering in the frost did not start with a sudden burst of nostalgia. It started 5 days earlier, when a stranger in a tailored suit pulled into my driveway, walked straight past me, and offered $5,000 cash for a truck he had not even tried to start. 5 days before Vanessa tried to steal the Ford under the cover of darkness, I sat in my home office, rolling that rusted ignition key between my thumb and index finger. The jagged brass left a sharp, metallic smell on my skin. It was the scent of oxidized iron and neglect. My father passed away 6 months ago, but the division of his estate 3 weeks prior felt like a secondary, colder funeral. They handed me a joke expecting me to break. Instead, I took the punchline home. My monitors glowed with the stark white interface of my digital editing software. I was working on a layout for a corporate client, isolating complex foreground elements from their backgrounds. Using the pen tool, I mapped out the structural boundaries of the image, clicking node by node to separate the subject from the noise behind it. It requires intense focus and an understanding of visual hierarchy. You have to train your eyes to ignore the bright, distracting colors on the surface and look for the underlying geometry. My father taught me that discipline. He spent his weekends out in his drafty garage smelling of motor oil and turpentine. But he was rarely turning wrenches. He would spread out old architectural blueprints and vintage typography sheets on his workbench. He showed me how to break down color palettes and evaluate halftone patterns. He would tap his calloused finger against a complex diagram and tell me to look past the surface. He always said the top layer is a distraction and the real structure is underneath. He was teaching me to see the world the way he did. He was preparing me for the inheritance he could not write into a standard will, knowing his second wife Diane and his golden child Vanessa would contest any document that gave me a dime. My phone buzzed against the desk, vibrating a stack of color swatches. The screen illuminated with a new notification from the family group chat. Vanessa had uploaded another hyper-filtered photograph. She stood in front of the sweeping 40-acre timberland she had just inherited, wearing a designer trench coat and holding the property deed like a hunting trophy. The caption read, "Building my foundation, feeling so blessed." A second text arrived immediately after. It was from Greg, my stepfather. "Natalie, the neighborhood association is going to fine us for having that eyesore parked in our driveway. Move the junker today. I will not let your stubbornness drag your sister's property value down. Be an adult." I read the text. I looked at the rusted key resting on my desk. I did not type a reply. Responding to fabricated outrage only validates the person throwing the tantrum. I simply swiped the notification away and returned to my digital layout. I prefer cold pixels over emotional family theater. But my quiet routine fractured later that Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen pouring a fresh cup of coffee when a sleek black luxury sedan pulled onto my street. The car glided to a stop directly in front of my house, the low hum of its tuned engine vibrating through the window panes. A man stepped out of the driver's side door. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and Italian leather shoes that crunched deliberately on my gravel driveway. He did not walk toward my front porch. He bypassed my front door entirely and walked straight to the rusted Ford F250. He dropped to one knee in the dirt, unbothered by the dust settling on his expensive trousers. He pulled a high-lumen tactical flashlight from his inner jacket pocket and shined the harsh white beam directly at the truck's undercarriage and the rusted wheel wells. Every internal alarm I possessed began to ring. I set my coffee mug on the counter, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped out onto the porch. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice level and unhurried. The man stood up, brushing a speck of dust from his lapel. He offered a practiced, bright smile that did not reach his eyes. "Ms. Gonzalez," he said, walking toward the porch. "My name is Mr. Caldwell. I am an archivist and a vintage automotive collector. I was a quiet admirer of your late father's work. I understand you recently took possession of this vehicle." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a silver money clip, thick with crisp $100 bills. He peeled off 5 bills and held them out. "I will give you $500 cash right now to take this burden off your hands. I will even arrange the flatbed transport." I looked at his manicured fingernails. I looked at the stack of cash. The truck did not even have an intact windshield, and the engine block was visibly covered in a thick layer of corrosive rust. No genuine automotive collector would offer $500 without opening the hood to check the block casting numbers. "The truck is not for sale," I said. Caldwell's smile wavered, the charming facade cracking just a fraction. He stepped closer, the scent of expensive cologne masking the mountain air. "Let us be realistic, Ms. Gonzalez. You live in a quiet neighborhood. This vehicle is an eyesore. I will double the offer. $1,000. I folded my arms across my chest. "I appreciate your time, Mr. Caldwell, but my answer remains no." He snapped the money clip shut. The polite archivist vanished, replaced by someone cold and impatient. $2,000, he barked. Then, without waiting for a reply, $5,000, cash, today. You sign the title over and walk away rich. His eyes kept darting past my shoulder, fixating on the passenger side door of the truck. He was not looking at the vehicle. He was looking at a specific location within the vehicle. "I am not going to sell it," I said, matching his cold tone. "Please leave my property." Caldwell stared at me for a long, silent moment. He slipped the money clip back into his pocket. "You have no idea what you are dealing with," he said, his voice dropping to a low warning. "You do not want the friction that comes with that truck." He turned on his heel, walked back to his luxury sedan, and sped away, the tires kicking up a cloud of loose gravel. I stood on the porch until the dust settled. Caldwell the collector did not care about a 1974 Ford. He knew exactly what was hidden inside it, and he knew my father had died. If he was willing to drop $5,000 in cash on a stranger's driveway for a rusted shell, the hidden asset was worth exponentially more. And if a stranger knew about it, it was only a matter of time before Vanessa and Diane found out. The clock was ticking. I waited for the sun to drop below the tree line. Under the cover of dusk, I dragged a heavy halogen floodlight from my garage and positioned it in the driveway. The amber glow cut through the encroaching darkness, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. I gathered a heavy steel pry bar, a rubber mallet, and a headlamp. I opened the passenger side door of the Ford. The hinges shrieked, a sound of dry metal grinding against dry metal. The cabin smelled like decades of trapped heat and decaying vinyl. I strapped the headlamp to my forehead and climbed inside. The false floor pan my father had constructed was a masterclass in structural illusion. To the untrained eye, the brittle rubber matting and the rusted retaining clips worked like standard factory original decay. But the geometry was flawed. The elevation of the floorboard on this side did not match the structural slope of the driver's side. I jammed the flat edge of the steel pry bar under the brittle rubber mat. I brought the mallet down hard on the heel of the bar. A sharp crack echoed in the cabin as the rusted retaining clips gave way. I worked methodically, stripping away the rotten foam insulation and the false sheet metal cover. My breath caught in my throat. Bolted directly to the heavy steel chassis of the truck was a custom-welded, climate-sealed titanium lockbox. Thick, insulated wires ran from the box directly into the main wiring harness of the vehicle. My father had not just hidden the box, he had wired it as a permanent kill switch. The engine was not seized. It was intentionally paralyzed to prevent anyone from driving the vault away. Flush against the top of the titanium lid was a heavy-duty mechanical keypad, 4 recessed buttons. I wiped a layer of dust away with my thumb. I closed my eyes and searched my memory. 3 years ago, my father had sent me a brief, seemingly random text message. "Keep my old factory badge number in your files, Nat, just in case you ever need to verify my work history." I had thought it was a strange request at the time, but I saved the contact card. I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled through my archives. 7249. I pressed the cold metal buttons in sequence. The keypad clicked with a heavy, satisfying mechanical engagement. A sharp hiss of pressurized air escaped the seams as the watertight seal broke. The lid unlatched, rising slightly on spring-loaded hinges. I carefully pushed it open, adjusting the beam of my headlamp to illuminate the interior. Inside the vault, resting in a custom-molded foam cradle, were thick stacks of archival-quality, acid-free tissue paper. I carefully lifted the top layer of paper. Beneath it lay a substantial, pristine portfolio. It was filled with heavy, medium-format photographic glass plates and hand-drawn vintage graphic layouts. Even in the harsh light of the headlamp, I could see the iconic, unmistakable signatures of a legendary 20th-century graphic artist. These were original, unreleased concert posters and intimate behind-the-scenes portraits of famous musicians. It was a holy grail of graphic design history given to my father to settle an old debt. But as I lifted one of the heavy glass plates to inspect it, the initial rush of triumph faded into a cold, sobering reality. The edges of the glass were clouded. The imagery trapped inside the plates was heavily oxidized, obscured by decades of chemical degradation. To anyone else, they would look like ruined, dirty glass. If Vanessa had found them, she would have thrown them in the county landfill without a second thought. My father knew that. He knew the physical plates required a specific, highly trained intellect to resurrect them. He had left me a fortune, but he had locked it behind a puzzle that only my exact technical expertise could solve. I needed to digitize and restore these masterpieces layer by layer before they could be authenticated. And as I stared at the clouded glass, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A new text message from my mother illuminated the screen. Vanessa is coming by tomorrow afternoon to get the truck. She decided she wants it for sentimental reasons. Have the keys ready. The archivist had made his calls. The family was coming for the vault. The text message from my mother sat on my screen, a bright digital demand cutting through the quiet of my home office. Vanessa is coming by tomorrow afternoon to get the truck. She decided she wants it for sentimental reasons. Have the keys ready. I set my phone face down on the desk. The archivist Caldwell had made his calls. Rebuffed by my refusal to take his cash, he had clearly contacted my family, hoping they would be easier to manipulate. He told them the rusted shell held value, and now the golden child was marching over to claim her discarded prize. But she did not know the true nature of the asset, and she certainly lacked the capacity to extract it. I carried the tissue-wrapped bundles from the titanium vault into my office, sliding the heavy deadbolt shut behind me. I turned on my high-resolution flatbed scanner, the specialized hardware I rely on for intricate graphic design archiving. The room smelled of ozone and aged paper. I carefully unfolded the archival tissue, exposing the first medium-format photographic glass plate to the harsh studio lighting. The edges of the glass were rough, the surface clouded by decades of chemical oxidation. To an impatient observer, the imagery trapped inside looked ruined, obscured by a milky barrier of decay. My father knew this. He knew the physical plates required a highly trained intellect to resurrect. He had locked his fortune behind a technical puzzle, ensuring only my specific expertise could solve it. I placed the first fragile plate onto the scanner glass and initiated a maximum resolution capture. The machine hummed, sweeping a brilliant line of light across the oxidized surface. I imported the raw data into my digital workspace. Using my professional editing software, I applied structural image analysis, isolating the chemical noise from the underlying silver gelatin exposure. It was a slow, methodical extraction. I adjusted the contrast thresholds, mapped the original halftone dots, and rebuilt the missing shadows, pixel by pixel. I spent hours isolating the complex foreground elements from the degraded background layers. When I stripped away the final veil of digital static, the image emerged on my monitor in pristine clarity. It was an unreleased candid portrait of a 1960s rock icon. The composition was flawless. The provenance, combined with the distinctive signature etched into the corner, confirmed its authenticity. I spent the next 14 hours locked in that room, fueled by black coffee and cold determination. I restored 24 distinct masterworks, saving the pristine digital proofs to a pair of encrypted solid-state drives. The physical plates remained clouded, but the digital verification was undeniable. By dawn, the adrenaline gave way to strategic calculation. Vanessa was coming for the truck. I needed to secure the real asset, but I also needed to give my sister exactly what she expected to find. I needed a distraction. I walked out to my garage and gathered a specific collection of items. 2 thick, grease-stained Haynes repair manuals for outdated carburetors, a rusted socket wrench set missing several drives, a heavy iron C-clamp. I carried the load out to the driveway. The morning frost crunched under my boots. I climbed into the cab of the Ford, entered my father's badge number into the titanium keypad, and opened the vault. I placed the worthless tools and manuals inside, letting them settle with a dull thud that perfectly mimicked the weight of the glass plates. I closed the titanium lid, engaged the watertight seal, and locked the keypad. I pressed the rotten rubber matting back into place over the false floorboard. The bait was set. Returning to my office, I carefully wrapped the fragile glass plates in their archival tissue. I placed them, along with the encrypted hard drives, into an unassuming canvas duffel bag. At precisely 2 in the afternoon, a white luxury SUV pulled onto my street and parked abruptly behind the rusted Ford. The driver's side door swung open. Vanessa stepped out. She wore a tailored cashmere coat and oversized sunglasses, looking entirely out of place in my modest driveway. She did not glance at the truck. She marched straight to my front porch and knocked sharply on the wood. I opened the door, leaning against the frame. I did not invite her inside. "Natalie," she said, pushing her sunglasses up onto her head. She offered a tight, rehearsed smile. "I am so glad you are home. Mom texted you, right? I am here for the truck." I looked at her. Her posture was rigid, her hands tucked deep into her coat pockets. "Why do you want the truck, Vanessa? You called it junk 3 weeks ago." She manufactured a small sigh, looking down at her designer boots. "I know what I said, but I have been doing a lot of thinking. It was Dad's favorite project. Seeing it sitting here rotting away, it just breaks my heart. I want to take it to my new property and restore it, for his memory." Her performance was hollow. Her eyes kept darting past my shoulder, trying to see inside my house. She lacked the patience for genuine grief. "The truck is my legal property," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "It was left to me in the estate division. You took the house, you took the timberland, you took the cash accounts. I am keeping the Ford." Vanessa's fake empathy vanished. Her jaw tightened, the muscles flexing under her contoured makeup. "You do not even have a garage to put it in, Natalie. You are just being stubborn. Mom and Greg agree that it belongs on the family estate." "It is not an estate asset anymore," I replied. "It is mine, and it is not for sale or transfer." She took a step closer, her voice losing its measured cadence. "Do not play games with me. A collector called Greg last night. He said that piece of trash is housing a rare vintage compartment. He offered $10,000 for the chassis alone. You hid that from us during the will reading." So Caldwell had doubled his offer to the golden child. The truth always floats to the surface. "I hid nothing," I said. "You threw the key at me. You laughed. You made your choice. Now I am making mine. Have a safe drive home, Vanessa." I stepped back and pushed the door closed. She caught the edge of the heavy wood frame with her hand, her acrylic nails digging into the paint. Her face contorted, stripping away the polished exterior to reveal the spoiled, furious child underneath. "You are going to regret this," she hissed. "You think you are so smart playing with Dad's junk. I will have the estate lawyers tie you up in court until you are bankrupt. You will hand over those keys begging me to take them." I looked down at her hand gripping my doorframe. "Remove your hand or I will call the police and report a trespasser." She snatched her hand back as if the wood had burned her. She spun around, marching back to her SUV. She slammed the door, shifted into gear, and sped away, leaving dark tire marks on the asphalt. I locked the deadbolt. The physical confrontation was over, but the structural warfare had just begun. I picked up the canvas duffel bag containing the glass plates and the encrypted drives. I slipped out my back door, walked through the alleyway, and drove my compact sedan to the largest bank in Coeur d'Alene. I rented their most secure safety deposit box. I placed the canvas bag inside the steel drawer, turned the key, and felt the heavy click of institutional security. The physical assets were untouchable. Returning home, I opened my laptop and drafted a precise, highly detailed email. I addressed it to Ms. Montgomery, the director of a prestigious international auction house based in New York. I attached the encrypted, watermarked digital proofs of the restored layouts. I included my structural analysis, confirming the halftones, the original composition, and the artist's signature. I hit send, placing the bait for the legitimate art world. I did not have to wait long. Less than 3 hours later, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a New York area code. Ms. Montgomery did not bother with pleasantries. She verified my identity, confirmed her receipt of the digital proofs, and booked a first-class flight to Idaho for the following morning. The trap was functioning perfectly. I had secured an international auction director, safeguarded the authentic plates, and left my greedy sister focused entirely on an empty, rusted shell sitting in my driveway. But the illusion of a quiet evening shattered just after dinner. A courier in a stark white uniform walked up my front steps. He carried a thick, rigid cardboard envelope. He asked for my signature, handed me the package, and walked away. I broke the seal and pulled out a stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. It was a formal cease and desist order filed by a high-priced local attorney Vanessa had hired on retainer. The document demanded the immediate surrender of the vehicle and all intellectual property contained within its compartments, citing undue influence and hidden shared assets. She was trying to drain my resources through legal intimidation. She believed I would fold under the pressure of a lawsuit. She did not realize she had just handed me the blueprints to her own destruction. The heavy watermarked paper of the cease and desist order felt rigid in my hands. I sat at my desk reading the demands. The local attorney Vanessa hired had constructed a fishing expedition based on fabricated grievances. The document claimed the rusted Ford and any intellectual property associated with it were shared estate assets. It accused me of exercising undue influence over my biological father before his passing. It demanded the immediate surrender of the vehicle to a neutral impound lot pending a probate investigation. It was a calculated legal bluff designed to drain my financial resources. Vanessa and Diane assumed I would panic. They expected me to hire my own expensive defense counsel to counter their claims. They wanted to bleed my freelance income dry until I surrendered the truck out of pure fiscal exhaustion. But my career is built on examining complex structures and finding the hidden flaws in the layers. I read the legal petition a second time, focusing on the specific phrasing. The entire foundation of their claim rested on a single, fragile assumption. They were arguing that whatever Caldwell the archivist was looking for had been acquired during my father's marriage to Diane, making it community property subject to division. To shatter their legal maneuver, I needed undeniable provenance. I needed documented proof establishing the exact date my father acquired the vintage graphic layouts and the photographic plates. I looked toward the secure bank vault key resting on my desk. The digital scans I had already produced were flawless representations of the art, but they did not contain a bill of sale. I closed my eyes and visualized the titanium lockbox bolted to the chassis of the Ford. I replayed the sensory details of the extraction. I remembered the heavy mechanical click of the keypad. I remembered the sharp hiss of pressurized air escaping the watertight seal. Then I remembered the geometry. The external housing of the lockbox dropped nearly 8 inches deep into the modified floor pan, but the interior depth where I had retrieved the first set of plates and subsequently placed the bait tools was only 5 inches deep. 3 inches of vertical space were unaccounted for. I stood up, grabbed my headlamp, and walked out the front door. The Idaho night was bitter cold, the frost thickening on the asphalt. I crossed the driveway to the rusted truck. I opened the passenger door, wincing at the dry grind of the metal hinges. I pulled back the brittle rubber matting to expose the false floorboard and the titanium keypad. I punched in the 4 digits of my father's old factory badge number. The heavy lid unlatched. I opened it and stared down at the grease-stained repair manuals and rusted tools I had placed inside hours earlier. I carefully lifted the bait out, setting the heavy items on the vinyl bench seat. The bottom of the lockbox was lined with a dense, custom-molded foam. I ran my fingertips along the perimeter, pressing into the corners. My thumb caught a rigid metallic seam hidden beneath the foam overlap. I pressed down hard on the left corner while pulling up on the right. A secondary mechanical catch released. Another sharp hiss of pressurized air escaped a lower watertight seal. The false bottom of the lockbox lifted upward on a set of hidden low-profile pneumatic hinges. I leaned closer, adjusting the beam of my headlamp. Inside this hidden lower chamber, swathed in multiple layers of acid-free tissue paper, was a substantial portfolio. It was secured with a leather binding strap that had stiffened with age. This was the true floorboard secret my father had sought to protect. I carefully extracted the portfolio. It possessed a dense, significant weight. I closed the lower chamber, replaced the bait tools, locked the primary titanium lid, and secured the rubber matting. I carried the portfolio back into my house, engaging the heavy deadbolt on my front door. I set the bundle on my specialized drafting table under the bright studio lights. The room smelled of aged leather and dust. I unbuckled the stiff binding strap and peeled back the archival tissue. Inside lay the master collection. These were original, medium-format photographic glass plates and hand-drawn vintage graphic layouts from the 1960s. They were the foundational proofs for unreleased concert posters and intimate portraits of legendary musicians. A typed ledger folded neatly inside the front cover detailed the transfer of these specific items to my father by a famous artist to settle a significant personal debt. The ledger was dated 3 years before my father ever met Diane. It was the exact provenance I needed to destroy their legal claim. However, my heart sank when I held the master photographic plates up to the light. These specific items had suffered severe environmental damage before my father sealed them away. The glass plates were heavily oxidized. The imagery was clouded by decades of chemical degradation, turning the silver gelatin emulsion into a murky, unintelligible gray film. To an untrained eye, they looked like ruined, worthless scraps of glass. If Vanessa had bypassed my bait and found this lower chamber, she would have thrown these master plates in the trash without a second thought. She lacked the patience and the intellect to see their potential. But my father knew my specific skill set. He knew I possessed the exact technical expertise required to digitally resurrect these lost masterpieces. The real work was just beginning. I booted up my high-resolution flatbed scanner and imported the raw captures into my digital workspace. I spent the rest of the night applying advanced structural image analysis to the damaged files. I isolated the chemical noise, mapping the degradation patterns, and subtracting them from the underlying exposure. I adjusted the contrast thresholds and painstakingly rebuilt the shadows pixel by pixel. Slowly, the pristine vintage layouts emerged from the digital static. The final master plate revealed a stunning candid portrait of a rock icon flawless in its composition. More importantly, etched into the bottom corner of the original layout was a handwritten dedication from the artist, directly to my father, complete with a timestamp that predated his second marriage by 3 full years. I had just secured the ultimate legal shield. I saved the restored proofs to my encrypted drives, feeling a profound sense of vindication. My father had orchestrated this entire puzzle to ensure the right daughter inherited his legacy. I leaned back in my chair, watching the morning sun crest the distant tree line through my office window. The trap was fully armed. The physical truck in my driveway held worthless bait. The authentic assets were locked in a bank vault. The undeniable proof of ownership was digitized on my secure network. I was ready to let Vanessa drag me into court and humiliate her on the public record. Then my phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of Ms. Montgomery, the international auction director, who was currently en route to Boise. I answered the call. She did not waste time with pleasantries. Her tone was clipped and highly professional, betraying a rigid undercurrent of stress. She informed me that her legal department in New York had just received an emergency injunction notice. Vanessa and her local attorney had not just sent me a cease and desist letter. They had contacted the auction house directly, threatening to name the gallery as a co-defendant in a fraud lawsuit if they proceeded with the appraisal or sale of the collection. They were moving to block the auction, publicly threatening the reputation of an elite international institution. My sister was no longer just throwing tantrums in my driveway. She was actively attempting to burn down the entire art deal out of pure spite. The legal bluff had escalated into a high-stakes corporate conflict. The voice of Ms. Montgomery filtering through my phone speaker held a sharp, strained frequency. As the director of a prestigious New York auction house, she trafficked in certainty and flawless provenance. The sudden arrival of a legal injunction from my sister's attorney had disrupted that certainty. Vanessa was threatening to name the gallery as a co-defendant in a fraud lawsuit, claiming the vintage layouts and photographic plates were contested marital assets belonging to my mother Diane. A lesser institution might have ignored the threat, but Montgomery operated in a world where reputation was currency. The mere hint of a legal dispute over ownership could deter wealthy buyers and ruin a highly publicized event. She informed me that her corporate counsel advised freezing the appraisal process. The flight to Idaho was paused. The exhibition was in jeopardy. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer emotional defenses or complain about my sister's entitlement. Frustration is a useless metric in a business transaction. I listened to the director outline her concerns, maintaining a steady, measured breathing pattern. When she finished, I told her I would provide irrefutable forensic proof of ownership within the hour, demonstrating a timeline that predated my father's second marriage by 3 years. I disconnected the call and turned toward my workstation. I had extracted the master portfolio from the hidden lower chamber of the titanium vault just hours prior. The digital restoration had revealed the pristine imagery, but a digital file is not enough to defeat a formal legal injunction. I needed to authenticate the physical artifacts using the rigorous standards of my profession. I transformed my quiet home office into a high-technical forensic lab. I lowered the ambient room lighting and engaged my primary diagnostic tool. The soft glow of the light box illuminated the dark room, casting a clinical, crisp white square across my drafting table. I carefully unbuckled the stiff leather binding strap of the master portfolio and extracted the typed ledger and the artist's handwritten dedication. I placed the delicate documents onto the illuminated glass surface. Utilizing my specialized jeweler's loupe, I leaned over the lightbox. My career in structural image analysis requires an intimate understanding of how ink interacts with fiber. Modern inkjet or laser printers deposit toner flatly onto the surface of a page, creating a uniform, lifeless layer. Vintage typewriters and authentic fountain pens function through physical force and capillary action. Through the magnification of the loupe, the hidden topography of the 1960s ledger became visible. The metal type bars had struck the vellum with varying degrees of pressure, creating microscopic craters in the paper fibers. The ink pooled deeply in these indentations, a mechanical signature impossible to fake with modern reproduction techniques. I shifted the loupe to the artist's handwritten dedication etched into the corner of the primary layout. I analyzed the fluid dynamics of the graphite. The ink absorption varied precisely with the speed and hesitation of the human hand. Where the pen lingered, the fiber saturation spread outward in microscopic tendrils. Where the stroke was fast, the line narrowed cleanly. The date written beside the signature was bold and uncorrected, establishing the timeline long before Diane ever entered my father's life. Next, I examined the unoxidized corners of the master photographic plates. The soft glow of the lightbox illuminated perfectly preserved halftone dots. In vintage commercial printing, these dots dictate the shading and gradient of the final image. I mapped the specific angles of the screens. The geometric rosettes formed by the overlapping halftone dots were the distinct, undeniable fingerprint of mid-century offset lithography. Every structural element validated the age, origin, and authenticity of the collection. I attached a macro lens to my professional camera rig and captured high-resolution close-ups of these microscopic details. I photographed the varying ink depths, the typewriter indentations, the halftone rosettes, and the specific watermark embedded in the fibrous vellum. I compiled these dense forensic images into a secure digital dossier. I drafted a concise factual summary to accompany the visual evidence. I detailed the technical differences between modern forgeries and authentic period artifacts. I referenced the specific date on the artist's dedication, cross-referencing it with my father's public marriage records. I created a timeline built entirely on verifiable data, stripping away any room for Vanessa's fabricated narrative. I uploaded the encrypted dossier to the gallery's secure corporate portal and sent a brief text to Ms. Montgomery, confirming the transmission. The ensuing wait was an exercise in calculated patience. I sat at my desk, listening to the rhythmic ticking of my wall clock and the low hum of my computer's cooling fans. I watched the dust motes drift through the beam of my desk lamp. My family had spent their entire lives relying on loud theatrical manipulation to get their way. They assumed whoever yelled the loudest or cried the hardest controlled reality. They were about to learn that empirical evidence does not care about volume. 45 minutes later, my phone rang. Ms. Montgomery's name illuminated the screen. Her tone had shifted entirely. The strained frequency was gone, replaced by the smooth, confident cadence of a woman who held a winning hand. She informed me that her legal department had reviewed my forensic dossier. The macro photography of the ink indentations and the halftone dots, combined with the clear date on the dedication, provided an ironclad defense. The premarital timeline was undeniable. The collection was my father's separate property, making it immune to Diane's community property claims. The corporate counsel had officially dismissed Vanessa's injunction as a baseless, frivolous filing. Ms. Montgomery was currently standing at her terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport. She was boarding her flight to Boise. The exhibition and the auction would proceed exactly as planned. I thanked her, ended the call, and allowed myself a single, quiet exhale. The legal shield held firm. The structural integrity of my father's plan was flawless. But my analytical mind quickly pivoted to the next variable. I understood my sister's psychology intimately. A narcissist, denied their unearned prize, does not simply apologize and surrender. When their preferred method of control fails, their behavior destabilizes. Vanessa had paid a local attorney a substantial retainer to freeze my assets. Within the hour, that attorney would call her to report the humiliating defeat. She would realize the legal route was permanently closed. She would realize the gallery was ignoring her threats. The realization would strip away her polished, wealthy facade, leaving only desperate entitlement. If the law refused to hand her the hidden fortune, she would resort to the only other tactic she understood. She would try to take it by brute force. I walked into my kitchen and prepared a mug of chamomile tea. The afternoon sun dipped below the rugged Idaho tree line, casting long, sharp shadows across my neighborhood. I stood by the front window, keeping my silhouette hidden behind the heavy fabric of the curtains. Around 8 in the evening, a familiar white luxury SUV rolled slowly down my street. It did not stop, but the brake lights flared briefly as it passed my driveway. Vanessa was casing the property. An hour later, Greg's heavy-duty pickup truck performed the same slow patrol. They were coordinating. They were preparing to bypass the legal system entirely. I did not call the police to report suspicious vehicles. I needed them to commit to their mistake. I needed them to cross the line from a civil dispute into a documented criminal act. The canvas duffel bag containing the authentic glass plates, the vintage layouts, and the typed ledger was safely locked inside the downtown bank vault. The encrypted drives were backed up on a secure cloud server. The rusted 1974 Ford F250 sitting on my concrete pad was an empty shell. The false floorboard concealed nothing but a stack of grease-stained repair manuals and rusted socket wrenches. I turned off all the interior lights in my house. I carried my mug of tea to the unlit entryway and stood near the front door. The temperature dropped, glazing the asphalt with a thin layer of frost. I held my phone in my hand, my thumb resting over the camera application. The hours stretched into the deep night. The neighborhood grew silent. Then, right at 2 in the morning, the deep, guttural rumble of a heavy diesel engine echoed down the block. The sweeping headlights of a commercial flatbed tow truck washed across my living room wall. The vehicle backed slowly into my driveway, the reverse warning chime piercing the quiet mountain air. I raised my phone. The sound of forged steel dragging across poured concrete signaled the start of their final catastrophic error. The sweeping headlights of the commercial flatbed tow truck washed across my living room wall, casting elongated shadows that danced over my furniture. The reverse warning chime pierced the quiet Idaho night, a rhythmic electronic pulse that signaled the climax of a highly predictable behavioral pattern. I stood perfectly still in the unlit entryway of my home, obscured by the heavy fabric of my curtains. The ambient temperature in the house was a comfortable 68 degrees, a stark contrast to the bitter frost settling on the asphalt outside. Through the thick glass of my front window, I watched Ryan step down from the passenger side of the tow cab. His breath plumed in the freezing air, creating small white clouds that quickly dissipated into the darkness. He wore a designer puffer jacket, an expensive garment entirely unsuited for manual labor. He rubbed his gloved hands together and gestured toward the rusted grille of my 1974 Ford F-250. Vanessa emerged a moment later, her posture rigid against the biting cold. She wrapped a cashmere scarf tightly around her neck, her eyes darting nervously up and down the quiet suburban street. She believed she was executing a brilliant tactical maneuver. She thought she was bypassing the legal system to secure her rightful inheritance. She did not realize she was performing the exact sequence of actions I had designed for her. As a professional graphic designer, I understand the concept of visual hierarchy. When you construct a digital layout, you use bright colors, sharp contrast, and prominent placement to guide the eye of the user toward a specific focal point. You give them an obvious target to click, allowing them to feel in control of the interface while you dictate their exact journey. Human psychology operates on the same structural principles. If you want to trap a predator, you do not hide the bait. You place it in the center of the room, paint it in neon, and let their own momentum do the work. I knew Vanessa was watching my house. I knew Greg was patrolling my neighborhood in his pickup truck. They were obsessed with the rusted shell sitting on my concrete pad. If I had hired a transport service to move the Ford to a secure storage facility, their paranoia would have spiked. They would have hired private investigators to track the vehicle. They would have harassed my clients and created a public spectacle. A narcissist denied their prize will burn down the entire forest just to find the ash. I needed to offer them a tangible victory to neutralize their focus. Instead of hiding the vehicle, I had devised a diversionary bait to make my enemies complacent. The preparation required precise physical execution. The day before, I had gathered a specific collection of items from my garage workbench. I selected 2 thick, grease-stained Haynes repair manuals for outdated automotive carburetors. I found a rusted socket wrench set housed in a cracked plastic case. I picked up a heavy iron C-clamp, feeling the dense weight of the cold metal in my palm. I carried these discarded items out to the driveway in the broad daylight, fully aware that invisible eyes might be tracking my movements. I opened the passenger door of the Ford, pulled back the brittle rubber matting, and entered my father's factory badge number into the titanium keypad. When the heavy lid unlatched with its signature hiss of pressurized air, I dropped the worthless tools inside. The heavy thud of the rusty tools hitting the custom-molded foam perfectly mimicked the heft and resonance of the vintage glass plates. It was a sensory detail designed to trick the mind. Anyone opening that vault in a rush would feel the substantial weight and immediately assume they had secured the treasure. I locked the keypad, engaged the watertight seal, and left the truck sitting conspicuously in my driveway. It was an invitation printed on rusted steel. With the physical decoy established, I needed to secure the genuine assets. I packed the authentic 1960s photographic plates, the vintage graphic layouts, and my encrypted solid-state hard drives into a discreet navy blue canvas duffel bag. I dressed in unremarkable casual clothing, exited through my back door, and walked down the narrow gravel alleyway behind my property to where my compact sedan was parked. I drove across town using a circuitous route, ensuring no luxury SUVs or heavy-duty pickup trucks were tailing my rear bumper. My destination was the largest and oldest bank in Coeur d'Alene. The interior of the financial institution smelled of floor wax and sterilized air. I rented their most secure safety deposit box, located deep within the subterranean vault. The bank manager guided me through a thick steel door into a room lined with polished aluminum drawers. I slid my key into the secondary lock, feeling the heavy mechanical click of institutional security. I placed the canvas duffel bag inside the long metal drawer and pushed it flush against the wall. The authentic portfolio was now protected by reinforced concrete, armed security personnel, and layers of federal banking regulations. My father's legacy was untouchable. Vanessa took the bait without a single moment of critical hesitation. Her entitlement blinded her to the possibility of a trap. Believing the multi-million-dollar art was still bolted to the chassis of the truck, she authorized her high-priced local attorney to escalate the conflict. A courier had delivered a thick stack of watermarked legal documents to my front door. It was a formal cease and desist letter demanding the immediate surrender of all intellectual property within the vehicle. The legal petition claimed the truck and its hidden compartments were an undivided estate asset. I sat at my drafting table reading the formal threats with a sense of profound amusement. I calculated the billable hours Vanessa was racking up. Her attorney likely charged $400 an hour to draft those aggressive demands. She was draining her inheritance, spending thousands of dollars on legal fees to secure the rights to a pair of old repair manuals and a rusted iron clamp. I did not reply to the letter. I did not hire defense counsel to contest the claims. Silence is a vacuum, and anxious people will inevitably fill that vacuum with expensive mistakes. Let them fight for a mirage. Let them exhaust their financial reserves chasing a shadow I had painted on the wall. While Vanessa was busy paying lawyers to draft useless documents, I was finalizing the real transaction. I contacted Ms. Montgomery, the director of the prestigious international auction house based in New York. I utilized a secure encrypted email channel to send her my meticulously restored visual layouts. I included the forensic macro photography of the vintage typewriter indentations, the halftone rosettes, and the artist's handwritten dedication. Ms. Montgomery is a woman who deals in empirical truth. She reviewed the digital proofs alongside her team of senior art historians. The structural image analysis I provided was flawless. She authenticated the digital files within hours. She did not bother with formal letters or legal threats. She recognized a historic discovery and acted with clinical efficiency. She immediately booked a first-class flight to Idaho, securing her position to represent the collection at a global auction. The legitimate art world was mobilizing to validate my professional expertise, bringing the weight of international collectors and historic preservationists to my doorstep. Meanwhile, the illegitimate thieves of my family were shivering in my driveway, attempting to steal a rusted shell. Outside my window, the winch motor engaged with a high-pitched mechanical whine. The thick steel cable snapped taut. The front suspension of the Ford groaned in protest as the heavy chassis was dragged forward onto the inclined ramp of the flatbed. Ryan stood near the controls, his breath coming in short, rapid puffs as he guided the tires onto the steel tracks. Vanessa watched the truck inch upward, her eyes fixed on the passenger side door. She was shivering, but a tight, triumphant smile stretched across her face. She thought she had won. She believed she had outmaneuvered the quiet sister who never fought back. The trap was perfectly set. The steel hook was firmly lodged in her jaw, and she was doing all the work to reel herself in. The whining pitch of the hydraulic winch motor cut through the freezing Idaho air. I stood in the darkened entryway of my home, watching the heavy steel cable pull my rusted 1974 Ford F250 up the inclined ramp of the commercial flatbed. The distinct heavy clank of a tow chain hitting the concrete driveway echoed across the quiet suburban street. It was a resonant, metallic slap that signaled the point of no return. My sister Vanessa stood near the rear bumper of the tow truck, her arms crossed tightly over her cashmere coat. She was shivering, though whether from the bitter frost or the adrenaline of committing a midnight heist, I could not say. Next to her stood Ryan, her fiancé. Ryan was a local commercial real estate agent whose primary talent involved staging empty properties to look more valuable than their underlying foundation. He trafficked in optics. He wore a designer puffer jacket and drove a leased luxury SUV, projecting an image of wealth while quietly drowning in leveraged debt. I knew his commissions had dried up months ago. He needed this stolen asset just as much as Vanessa did, viewing my rusted truck as a financial life raft. They believed the multi-million-dollar art collection was still secured inside the titanium lockbox, bolted to the passenger floorboard. They had decided to bypass the slow, expensive legal system. Why wait for a judge to rule on an injunction when you can simply take the prize under the cover of darkness? I unlocked the deadbolt on my front door. The heavy brass mechanism turned with a satisfying, solid click. I pushed the door open and stepped out onto the porch. The frigid night air hit my face, carrying the sharp scent of diesel exhaust and frozen pine. I did not wear a heavy coat. I wore my simple cotton pajamas and a pair of hard-soled slippers. I leaned casually against the wooden railing of my porch and held up my smartphone. The screen cast a pale blue glow across my face. I tapped the red circle on the screen, initiating the video recording. The sudden appearance of a witness startled them. Ryan jerked his head toward my porch, his gloved hands freezing on the winch controls. Vanessa gasped, taking a quick step backward until her designer boots hit the curb. "You are trespassing," I called out. I did not yell. I pitched my voice to a calm conversational volume, letting the quiet stillness of the neighborhood carry the sound directly to their ears. Ryan recovered his composure first. He puffed out his chest, relying on the artificial bravado he used to close bad property deals. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, waving it in the air like a shield. "We have authorization," Natalie Ryan shouted across the lawn. "The estate granted us the title. This is a legal repossession. Go back inside before you embarrass yourself." I kept the camera lens trained steady on his face, ensuring the street lamp illuminated his features. A legitimate repossession agent does not operate a flatbed in a residential neighborhood at 2 in the morning without local law enforcement present. A legitimate agent does not try to muffle the sound of the chains. "That paperwork is forged," I replied, my tone unwavering. "The probate court awarded the vehicle to me. You are currently attempting to steal it." Vanessa stepped forward, her face twisting into a mask of spite. The polished, curated version of my sister vanished, replaced by the greedy child who always believed she deserved the largest slice of the cake. "It belongs to the family," she hissed, her voice sharp and brittle. "You hid the value from us. You lied. We are just taking back what Dad meant for me to have." Her logic was a fascinating study in cognitive dissonance. She had thrown the keys at me, called the truck worthless junk, and now claimed it was her destined inheritance. I did not argue with her fabricated narrative. Engaging with a narcissist's delusions only gives those delusions oxygen. Instead of debating the merits of her claim, I utilized a far more effective tool. I kept the video recording active, capturing their faces and the license plate of the tow truck. With my free hand, I tapped the screen of my phone, navigating to the dialer. I pressed 3 digits and activated the external speakerphone. I held the device out over the porch railing. The line rang once. A sharp, clear voice crackled from the speaker, cutting through the low rumble of the idling diesel engine. "Coeur d'Alene Emergency Dispatch, what is your location and emergency?" The psychological shift in my driveway was instantaneous. The fabricated bravery holding Ryan upright collapsed. He dropped the forged paperwork onto the frost-covered grass. The color drained from Vanessa's face, her mouth falling open in silent horror. They had expected me to scream. They had expected me to run out into the cold and throw myself onto the hood of the truck, providing them with the dramatic scene they craved. They had not expected clinical, documented accountability. Yes, I spoke clearly toward the phone. My name is Natalie Gonzalez. I am standing at my residence. There are 2 individuals currently stealing a motor vehicle from my driveway. They have a flatbed tow truck. Are the suspects still on the scene? The dispatcher asked, her voice steady and professional. They are, I said. I am looking at them right now. Ryan did not wait to hear the rest of the conversation. Pure, unfiltered panic overrode his greed. He slammed his hand against the winch control box, locking the steel cable into place. He did not bother to attach the secondary safety chains to the Ford's axles. He turned and sprinted toward the driver's side door of the tow cab. "Let us go!" he yelled, his voice cracking under the strain of terror. "Get in the truck, Vanessa! Move!" Vanessa scrambled toward the passenger side, her boots slipping on the icy concrete. She grabbed the handle and hoisted herself into the cab, slamming the heavy door shut. The diesel engine roared as Ryan pressed his foot onto the accelerator. The flatbed lurched forward. The rusted Ford shifted on the metal ramp, the suspension groaning as the tires squealed against the steel tracks. They sped off down the suburban street, blowing past a stop sign at the intersection. The taillights disappeared around the corner just as the faint, high-pitched wail of police sirens began to echo through the mountain valley. I remained on the porch, finishing my conversation with the emergency dispatcher. I provided the make and model of the flatbed, the license plate number I had captured on video, and the identities of the 2 thieves. 10 minutes later, a Coeur d'Alene police cruiser pulled up to my curb, its blue and red lights painting the front of my house in rhythmic flashes. 2 officers stepped onto my lawn. I invited them inside out of the freezing cold. I sat at my dining room table and handed them my smartphone, playing the crisp, high-definition footage of the theft. I provided them with a copy of the probate documents, proving my sole ownership of the 1974 Ford F-250. I answered their questions with factual precision, avoiding any emotional hyperbole. The older officer took notes on a small pad, shaking his head. "You have them dead to rights on camera, ma'am," he said. "We will put out an alert for the tow truck. With a vehicle that size, they will not get far. Do you want to press formal charges when we locate them?" "Yes," I replied without hesitation. "I want to file a formal report for Grand Theft Auto." The officers finalized their paperwork, establishing a bulletproof, documented paper trail of the crime. They thanked me for my calm cooperation and returned to their patrol car. I locked my front door and turned off the porch light. I walked back to my bedroom and pulled the warm covers up to my chin. The house was silent again. The physical truck was gone, but the true asset was secure in a downtown bank vault, waiting for the international auction director to arrive. I closed my eyes, a deep sense of peace washing over me. I pictured Ryan and Vanessa pulling that heavy flatbed into a secluded garage somewhere on the outskirts of town. I imagined the frantic, greedy energy they would expend tearing into the cab of the Ford. I envisioned Ryan firing up an angle grinder, sparks flying as he cut through the titanium lockbox. I pictured the exact moment the lid popped open and Vanessa reached inside, her fingers brushing against the grease-stained cover of a defunct carburetor repair manual. They had just committed a major felony, alienated themselves from the law, and ruined their futures. And they had done it all to steal a box of rusty wrenches. I fell asleep with a smile on my face, resting easily in the warmth of undeniable dramatic irony. The morning light broke over the Idaho tree line, casting a pale clinical glow through the broad windows of my home office. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the rhythmic drip of my coffee maker, feeling a profound sense of tranquility. The rusted Ford was gone from my driveway, leaving only a rectangular stain of old motor oil on the concrete. The physical theft had been documented by the local police. The authentic artifacts were secured behind reinforced steel at the downtown bank. The board was cleared, and the pieces were moving exactly as I had arranged them. At 9 o'clock sharp, a black town car pulled up to my curb. Ms. Montgomery stepped out onto the frost-covered asphalt. She wore a tailored wool blazer and carried a leather briefcase, projecting the distinct, unhurried authority of a woman who routinely curated historic acquisitions for elite buyers. I opened the front door and invited her inside. She did not offer hollow pleasantries about the weather or my home decor. We walked directly into my office, where I had prepared fresh coffee and configured my primary editing monitors to display the high-resolution restorations. She took a seat at my drafting table, slipping a pair of reading glasses from her pocket. For the next hour, she scrutinized the digital proofs. She examined the macro photography, detailing the vintage typewriter indentations and the overlapping halftone rosettes. She traced the fluid dynamics of the artist's signature with her index finger, nodding in silent approval. The meticulous nature of my structural image analysis provided the empirical verification she required. The provenance was undeniable. The collection was authentic, and the premarital timeline was cemented in forensic fact. As we discussed the logistical framework for transporting the physical plates from my bank vault to her secure gallery in Boise, a sharp chime emanated from my smartphone. A social media notification illuminated the lock screen. Vanessa is broadcasting live. I set my coffee mug down on the desk. I tapped the notification opening the video feed and mirrored my phone screen to the large secondary monitor mounted on my office wall. Ms. Montgomery leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap, watching the display with the detached curiosity of a theater critic attending a local play. The high-definition video feed revealed the interior of a sterile cinderblock garage. The harsh, fluorescent overhead lighting cast deep shadows across the concrete floor. The stolen Ford F250 sat in the center of the frame, still strapped to the deck of the commercial flatbed tow truck. Vanessa stood in the foreground, holding her phone at arm's length to ensure her face dominated the composition. She had applied fresh makeup and brushed her hair into deliberate loose waves. She looked directly into the camera lens, adopting a tone of righteous vindication. "Good morning, everyone," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I wanted to share a very special moment with you all today. As many of you know, our family recently lost our father. It has been a difficult transition, especially since certain people tried to hide his true legacy from us. But today, we are finally reclaiming our rightful family heritage." She spun the camera around, framing the passenger side of the rusted truck. Greg stood near the rear bumper, his arms crossed over his chest, wearing a smug, self-satisfied grin. Ryan stood inside the open door of the cab. He held a heavy industrial angle grinder in his gloved hands. He had stripped away the brittle rubber matting to expose the titanium lockbox bolted to the chassis. "We are opening the time capsule Dad left for us," Vanessa narrated, stepping closer to the vehicle. "Go ahead, Ryan," Greg called out from the background. "Cut it open." Ryan engaged the power switch. The abrasive cutting wheel spun to life with a deafening, high-pitched metallic shriek that distorted the microphone on Vanessa's phone. He pressed the spinning disc against the thick titanium lid. Bright sparks flew from the angle grinder, showering the dark interior of the cab in a cascade of brilliant orange light. The harsh grinding noise echoed through my quiet home office speakers. Titanium is an exceptionally resilient metal. It fought back against the abrasive wheel, requiring Ryan to lean his entire body weight into the tool. He grunted with exertion, the muscles in his jaw clenching as he slowly carved a jagged line through the reinforced seam of the lockbox. Ms. Montgomery took a slow sip of her coffee. "Your sister possesses a unique flair for public relations," she noted dryly. "She is a dedicated performer," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the screen. After 5 agonizing minutes of grinding, the structural integrity of the locking mechanism finally failed. Ryan disengaged the power tool, the spinning wheel whining as it slowed to a halt. He dropped the grinder onto the floorboard and grabbed a heavy steel crowbar. He jammed the flat edge under the compromised lid and leaned back. With a loud, echoing crack, the titanium panel bent upward, popping open. Vanessa shoved past Ryan, desperate to be the center of the frame for the grand reveal. She thrust her phone forward, capturing the dark interior of the custom-molded foam compartment. She reached her manicured hand inside with greedy, breathless anticipation. She grabbed the heavy object resting at the bottom and pulled it into the fluorescent light. It was a dog-eared, grease-stained Haynes repair manual for a 1974 Ford carburetor. As she lifted the book, a rusted iron C-clamp slipped from the pages and fell to the concrete floor with a dull, heavy thud. The silence that followed was profound. The triumphant narrative Vanessa had been spinning evaporated in an instant. The color drained from her face, leaving her contoured makeup looking stark and unnatural against her pale skin. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. The look of pure, unadulterated horror and deep confusion washing over her features was the most satisfying visual composition I had ever analyzed. Greg uncrossed his arms, his smug grin dissolving into an expression of blank bewilderment. He stepped forward, squinting at the greasy paper in his daughter's trembling hand. "What is that?" Greg demanded, his voice devoid of its usual authority. "Where is the rest of it?" Ryan stared at the empty titanium box, his chest heaving from the physical exertion. He looked at the rusted tool on the floor, then up at Vanessa. "There is nothing else in there," he whispered. "It is empty." Vanessa stared at the worthless manual. Her eyes widened as the devastating reality of her situation clicked into place. She had broadcasted a felony to her entire social network. She had hired a flatbed, broken numerous laws, and spent the entire night hiding a stolen vehicle, all to extract a piece of garbage. She lunged toward her phone screen, her face contorting in panic. The live stream abruptly ended, cutting to a static black screen. I reached over and turned off my monitor. The quiet tranquility of my office returned. Ms. Montgomery set her empty coffee mug on my desk, stood up, and smoothed the front of her blazer. "I believe we have concluded our verification process here," she said, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I will secure the transport team for the bank vault. We have a historic exhibition to prepare." She departed shortly after leaving me to enjoy the silence of my home. But the fallout from the empty shell game was bound to reach my doorstep. By noon, the inevitable retaliation arrived. A rapid, frantic pounding echoed through my house, rattling the glass panes of my front window. I did not rush to answer. I walked to the entryway at a measured pace and opened the heavy wooden door. My mother, Diane, stood on my porch. She looked nothing like the composed, soothing matriarch who had sat on the pristine white sofa weeks earlier. Her hair was slightly disheveled. Her designer handbag was clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. Her face was flushed with frantic energy, the polished facade slipping to reveal the raw desperation underneath. She completely ignored the fact that my vehicle had been stolen from this very spot hours prior. "Where is it, Natalie?" she demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "Where is the real art?" I leaned against the doorframe, keeping my posture relaxed and unbothered. "I do not know what you are talking about, Diane." "Do not play games with me," she shrieked, stepping closer. "Vanessa opened that box. We know you took the valuables out. You need to hand them over right now. Ryan is in debt. Vanessa's new boutique is failing. The property taxes on the timberland are due next week, and we are out of cash. It is your duty to help this family. You have to save the family home." I looked at her, analyzing the sheer audacity of her demands. She was not mourning my father. She was mourning the loss of her unearned wealth. She expected me to bail out her golden child, using the very assets they had tried to steal from me. The Ford F250 that was parked in my driveway was legally willed to me, I said, my voice cold and precise. "Last night, your daughter and her fiancé committed grand theft auto. They stole my property. I filed a formal police report with the Coeur d'Alene Police Department and provided them with high-definition video footage of the crime." Diane froze, her eyes widening in shock. "You called the cops on your own sister?" "I called the police on a car thief." I corrected her, And since you are standing on my porch demanding the contents of a stolen vehicle, that makes you an accessory after the fact. If you do not leave my property immediately, I will dial emergency dispatch and report your involvement." Her jaw dropped. She tried to formulate a response, stammering over her words, searching for the familiar levers of guilt and manipulation she had used her entire life. But the structural foundation of her reality had collapsed. I stepped back inside my house and firmly closed the heavy wooden door. The deadbolt engaged with a loud final click. Through the thick wood, I could hear her screaming my name, her fists pounding against the exterior. I did not flinch. I simply turned my back to the door and walked toward my kitchen to brew another pot of coffee. The noise outside was just the sound of a crumbling empire, and I had no intention of offering them a single brick to rebuild it. It had been 30 days since my mother pounded her fists against my heavy wooden front door. 30 days of stark silence from my relatives. I spent that month finalizing the auction catalog with the New York gallery director and enjoying the steady hum of my workstation. But structural rot does not heal in silence. It spreads beneath the surface until the foundation crumbles. At 6 in the morning on a chilly Tuesday, the blinking red indicator light on my phone signaled a new voicemail. I tapped the screen and raised the device to my ear. The voice of Diane spilled through the speaker, ragged and breathless. Her polished, soothing tone was entirely erased, replaced by the jagged cadence of pure panic. She did not ask how I was doing. She demanded salvation. "Natalie, you have to pick up the phone," she wept, her words overlapping in a frantic rush. The sound of a slamming door echoed in the background. "Ryan is gone. He packed his bags last night and left Vanessa. The creditors are calling the house every single hour. Greg had to liquidate his pension just to keep the lights on. Please, you have to withdraw the police report. You have to give us the art." I deleted the message before she finished gasping for air. The Golden Child's empire had fractured. I opened my web browser and navigated to the social media business page for Vanessa's luxury boutique. She had leveraged the inherited 40 acres of pristine timberland to secure a high-interest commercial loan for a retail storefront downtown. As a professional graphic designer, I evaluate visual branding within seconds. The digital presence of her store was a masterclass in aesthetic failure. She had mocked my career for years, calling it a hobby for people who could not secure real jobs. Yet she attempted to design her own marketing materials to save money. The results were tragic. The promotional logos were pixelated, jagged at the edges from poor resolution scaling. The color palettes clashed terribly, utilizing harsh neon hues against muted, muddy backgrounds. The typography was unbalanced, lacking proper kerning and negative space, which rendered the boutique name nearly illegible. She lacked the technical skills she had always diminished. Customers ignored the storefront. The high-end inventory sat gathering dust on the racks. Without the influx of cash she expected from stealing my truck, the commercial loan defaulted. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on the timberland. Ryan, the man who staged his life to project wealth, recognized a sinking ship. He required a partner who could fund his illusions. The moment the bank notices arrived in the mail, he took off the diamond engagement ring, left it on the kitchen counter, and vanished. He packed his leased SUV and drove away, abandoning Vanessa to face the financial wreckage alone. Diane and Greg, desperate to maintain their curated facade, stepped in to absorb the damage. They drained their retirement accounts to cover her immediate bad loans, crippling their own future to protect her fragile ego. But pouring water into a cracked vase does not fix the leak. The financial hemorrhage was fatal. Cornered animals do not retreat quietly. Later that same afternoon, a stranger in a faded windbreaker walked up my driveway. He carried a thick manila folder. He confirmed my name, handed me the heavy stack of paper, and walked away without another word. It was an emergency court injunction filed by Vanessa's attorney in the local county jurisdiction. While the New York Gallery Council had dismissed her initial threats, this was a formal legal maneuver executed on our home turf. The document baselessly claimed the vintage layouts and photographic plates were marital property shared by Diane. The filing sought to freeze the assets and halt the upcoming Boise exhibition pending a lengthy probate review. Her lawyer was playing a calculated war of attrition. They assumed a freelance designer could not afford a protracted legal battle. They bet I would run out of funds to hire defense counsel and ultimately settle out of court, surrendering a portion of the proceeds just to make the lawsuit disappear. They believed the threat of a public courtroom fight would force me into submission. They miscalculated my resources and my patience. I did not hire a local defense attorney to engage in endless, expensive filing wars. I did not call Vanessa to negotiate a truce. Instead, I drove to a high-end commercial print shop in downtown Coeur d'Alene. I rented their premier equipment for the afternoon. I produced crisp physical copies of the forensic macro photography I had compiled. The images detailed the specific ink indentations of the vintage typewriter, the overlapping halftone rosettes, and the artist's handwritten dedication. I printed the premarital ledger on heavy, watermarked cardstock. The scent of fresh toner filled the small room as the pages slid from the machine. I purchased several pristine black leather binders. I carefully arranged the documents, placing each forensic photograph next to its corresponding historical timeline marker. I built a narrative of empirical proof, structured so clearly that anyone with functioning eyes could understand the timeline. I compiled a bulletproof dossier that obliterated Diane's claim to the property. I kept this evidence a closely guarded secret. I did not file a response with the county clerk. I did not mail a copy to Vanessa's attorney. I allowed them to believe their injunction was uncontested. I let them sit in their crumbling home, thinking I was cowering in my office, overwhelmed by their brilliant legal maneuvering. The private preview event at the Boise Gallery was scheduled for the following evening. Wealthy collectors, gallery owners, and art historians from around the country were flying in to view the restored masterpieces. Champagne would be poured. The press would be present. I knew my family intimately. They would not miss an opportunity to create a theatrical spectacle. They believed they held a winning hand with the filed injunction, and they would want to deliver the killing blow in front of an audience. They were planning to ambush me in front of the city's elite, hoping the sheer embarrassment of a public legal dispute would force the gallery to drop my collection. I packed my tailored suit into a garment bag. I placed the black leather binders into my briefcase. I drove toward Boise as the sun dipped behind the rugged Idaho mountains, leaving the sky painted in bruised shades of purple and gray. The stage was set for a quiet demolition, and I held the detonator. The Boise Gallery occupied a renovated warehouse in the downtown arts district. Exposed brick walls contrasted with stark white partition boards, creating a modern labyrinth to showcase the restored 1960s layouts. Overhead, amber track lighting cast a warm, clinical glow on the illuminated displays. The room hummed with the quiet, measured murmurs of serious wealth. Art historians, gallery owners, and private collectors moved through the space with practiced grace, sipping sparkling cider from crystal flutes. I stood near the center display, wearing a tailored charcoal suit. The structured shoulders and crisp lines of the garment felt like armor. My entire life, I had dressed to blend into the background, allowing my sister to monopolize the spotlight. Tonight, I occupied the focal point. I watched a prominent local collector lean close to one of the pristine photographic plates, tracing the artist's signature through the glass display case with his eyes. He nodded in silent reverence. The meticulous weeks I spent performing structural image analysis had resurrected a lost piece of cultural history. My father's legacy was finally receiving the respect it deserved. Then the heavy glass entrance doors swung inward, shattering the sophisticated atmosphere. A gust of freezing mountain air swept into the foyer, rustling the coats hanging on the reception rack. The sharp click of high heels echoed across the polished concrete floor. The sound was frantic and uneven, lacking the rhythmic glide of the invited guests. I turned toward the entrance. My family had arrived, executing the theatrical ambush they believed would secure their stolen fortune. Vanessa marched into the gallery leading the formation. She wore a bright crimson dress that screamed for attention, a stark visual contradiction to the muted, elegant attire of the surrounding crowd. Her jaw was set, her eyes scanned the room, searching for the cameras, and the largest cluster of important people. Flanking her was my mother Diane, clutching a crumpled tissue in her fist. Greg walked half a step behind them, wearing a wrinkled navy sport coat that stretched too tight across his shoulders. He looked less like a concerned patriarch and more like a tired man dragged into a conflict he did not understand. Trailing the family was a man carrying a scuffed synthetic leather briefcase. He wore an ill-fitting gray suit and darted his eyes around the opulent room with visible unease. This was the local attorney they had hired on retainer, the architect of their baseless county court injunction. He looked entirely out of his depth. Vanessa did not wait for a host to greet her. She did not lower her voice to match the ambient volume of the room. She inhaled deeply and projected her words to ensure every single person in the gallery heard her fabricated outrage. "Stop the viewing!" Vanessa shouted, thrusting a manicured finger toward the nearest illuminated display. "Do not bid on any of this work. Every single piece in this room is stolen family property." The quiet hum of the gallery died instantly. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable, like a dropped glass that had not yet shattered. Dozens of wealthy patrons turned toward the entrance. A waiter carrying a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres froze mid-stride. Diane seized the sudden quiet to begin her performance. She pressed the crumpled tissue to her eyes and let out a loud theatrical sob. She had perfected this routine over decades of neighborhood disputes and parent-teacher conferences. She played the victimized mother, a woman betrayed by her own flesh and blood. "We just want our family legacy returned to us," Diane wept, her voice trembling with practiced grief. "My late husband acquired these pieces for our estate. Natalie sneaked into his garage and took them while we were mourning. She is a thief. We have a court injunction to shut this illegal sale down right now." They expected me to panic. They anticipated that a quiet, freelance graphic designer would crumble under the weight of a public scandal. They assumed I would rush forward, begging them to lower their voices, offering to sign over a percentage of the auction proceeds just to make the embarrassment go away. In their minds, social pressure was the ultimate weapon. I remained rooted in my position near the center display. I observed the physical reactions of the elite guests surrounding me. Old money does not tolerate loud desperation. A renowned art historian standing near me lowered his crystal flute to a nearby table, his lips pressed into a thin, tight line. An elderly woman draped in pearls physically stepped backward, creating a wide berth between herself and Vanessa. Her eyes narrowed in mild disgust. The patrons were not judging me. They were judging the chaotic, unrefined spectacle interrupting their exclusive evening. Montgomery, the gallery director, stepped out from her office near the back of the warehouse. She assessed the intrusion with a cold, calculating glare. She caught my eye across the room. She did not look panicked. She looked annoyed. I raised my right hand, offering a subtle, calm nod to the two uniformed security guards stationed near the coat check. The guards straightened their posture, shifting their weight, waiting for my final cue to intervene. I did not want them to simply drag my family out the door. A physical ejection would leave the wealthy buyers whispering about potential legal risks. I needed to sanitize the room. I needed to disinfect the lies Vanessa had just sprayed across my father's work. I reached down to the small cocktail table beside me and picked up the black leather binder I had prepared at the commercial print shop earlier that day. The leather felt smooth and substantial under my fingertips. It contained the forensic macro photography, the typed premarital ledger, and the chronological timeline that obliterated their injunction. It was a dossier of pure empirical truth. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored charcoal jacket. I took a slow, deep breath, centering my focus. Then I began to walk. My footsteps were deliberate and steady, echoing softly against the polished concrete. I did not rush. I navigated through the parting sea of elite guests, feeling their curious gazes tracking my movement. I closed the distance between the center display and the entryway, maintaining unbroken eye contact with my sister. Vanessa watched me approach. Her initial burst of triumphant adrenaline began to falter. The smug certainty on her face cracked, replaced by a flicker of genuine hesitation. She expected a cowering victim. She expected tears and apologies. She was watching a predator glide through the grass. Greg shifted uncomfortably, reaching out to touch Diane's elbow, as if to steady her. The local attorney wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, clutching his cheap synthetic briefcase tighter against his side. He recognized the confident posture of opposing counsel holding a winning hand. He realized he had walked into a trap. I stopped precisely 3 feet away from my sister. The freezing mountain air drafting from the glass doors washed over my shoulders, but I did not shiver. I held the black leather binder in my left hand, a silent counterweight to their loud, hollow accusations. "You are trespassing at a private invitation-only event," I stated. My voice carried the crisp, unyielding authority of someone who deals exclusively in verifiable facts. I did not raise my pitch. I did not match her frantic energy. "We have a court order," Vanessa countered, her voice pitching slightly higher as she gestured toward the nervous attorney beside her. "You cannot sell our property. We own half of everything in this building." The attorney cleared his throat, attempting to salvage his professional dignity in front of the silent, staring crowd. "My clients have filed an emergency petition in the county jurisdiction," he announced to the room, though his voice lacked conviction. "The assets are subject to a marital dispute." I looked at the attorney analyzing the poor fit of his collar and the slight tremor in his hands. "You filed a baseless petition built on perjury," I corrected him. "And you brought your clients here to stage a public disturbance because you know your filing will not survive a preliminary hearing." Diane gasped, lowering her tissue. "How dare you speak to us like that? We are your family." "You are a failed boutique owner drowning in commercial debt," I said, shifting my gaze directly to Vanessa. I ignored Diane completely. "You are a widow who drained her retirement accounts to cover your daughter's bad loans. And you are here because the bank is foreclosing on the timberland, and you are desperate for a bailout." Vanessa flinched as if I had struck her. The mention of her financial ruin, spoken aloud in front of the wealthiest people in the state, pierced her curated armor. The gallery guests murmured the quiet whispers of high society gossip rippling through the room. "That is a lie!" Vanessa shrieked, her face flushing crimson to match her dress. "We are here for the art." I lifted the black leather binder, feeling the weight of the undeniable proof resting in my palm. I was ready to open the cover. I was ready to dismantle their illusion layer by layer, exposing the deep structural rot of their greed in front of the city's most powerful people. The quiet demolition was about to begin, and I intended to leave nothing but dust in my wake. The air in the gallery felt heavy, thick with the unvoiced anticipation of the wealthy patrons watching our standoff. I stood in the center of the illuminated exhibition space, the focal point of dozens of calculating eyes. I held the black leather binder in my left hand. With my right thumb, I pressed the metal release tab on the spine. The crisp snap of the steel rings opening echoed across the polished concrete floor. It was a sharp mechanical punctuation mark that severed the lingering, uncomfortable silence. I extracted 2 identical bound copies of the forensic dossier I had compiled at the commercial print shop earlier that afternoon. I extended my arm, offering the first copy to the local attorney standing beside my sister. He hesitated, his eyes darting toward Vanessa, before his professional instincts overrode his misplaced loyalty. He reached out and took the heavy stack of watermarked cardstock. I handed the second copy to Ms. Montgomery, who stepped forward to receive it with a brisk, approving nod. I kept my focus entirely on the attorney. "Turn to page 3, I instructed him. My voice carried the steady, measured cadence of a professor delivering a final lecture to a failing student. You will find a certified copy of the original typed ledger, accompanied by high-resolution forensic macrophotography. Note the artist's handwritten dedication in the bottom corner of the primary graphic layout. The date is clearly visible, 1985. The attorney pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose. He opened the dossier and scanned the detailed paragraphs. I watched his eyes track the undeniable photographic proof. I watched him examine the microscopic typewriter indentations and the precise overlapping geometry of the vintage halftone rosettes. I shifted my gaze to Diane, watching the color drain from her cheeks as the reality of my preparation dawned on her. "That date is 3 full years before you married my father, Diane," I stated calmly. "These master plates and vintage layouts were acquired as separate premarital property. They were never commingled with joint funds. Your emergency injunction claims these are shared marital assets. The empirical evidence proves that claim is a fabricated lie. The collection is immune to your jurisdiction and immune to your greed." The attorney swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed against his tight collar. He knew a fraudulent filing when he saw one. He had been fed a false narrative by a desperate widow, and he had staked his professional license on the assumption that I would simply fold under pressure. "Turn to page 7. I directed the attorney, refusing to give them a single moment to recover their balance. "You will find an authenticated copy of the final amendment to my father's will. The clause highlights the transfer of the 1974 Ford F-250. Please read subsection B, aloud for your clients." The lawyer opened his mouth. His voice emerged as a dry, rasping whisper. "The vehicle, including all attached modifications, integrated compartments, and any contents housed within those compartments, is bequeathed solely to Natalie Gonzalez." I nodded slowly, letting the legal phrasing hang in the quiet air of the gallery. The estate did not just grant me a rusted chassis. My father explicitly willed me the hidden titanium vault and everything secured inside it. Your clients did not inform you of that specific clause when they retained your services, did they? The attorney closed the dossier. The realization of his perilous legal position hit him with visible force. He was standing in a room full of elite art collectors, acting as the aggressive tip of the spear for an attempted shakedown. Submitting a knowingly false petition to a county judge was a fast track to disbarment. He looked at Diane with an expression of profound betrayal. Then he physically took a long step backward, severing his proximity to my family. "I cannot represent this petition," the attorney muttered, addressing the floor rather than his former clients. He shoved the heavy dossier into his scuffed synthetic leather briefcase. He turned on his heel and walked swiftly toward the glass exit doors, abandoning the sinking ship without another glance. Greg stared at the polished concrete floor, his shoulders slumping under his wrinkled navy sport coat. He offered no defense. He recognized the checkmate. He had always enabled the cruelty of his wife and stepdaughter, but he lacked the fortitude to fight a battle he could not win. The defense counsel had fled. The matriarch was speechless. Only the golden child remained. I turned my attention to Vanessa. Her crimson dress suddenly looked less like a symbol of power and more like a neon target. Her jaw trembled. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to launch another baseless accusation or play the victim one final time. But I cut her off. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored charcoal jacket and pulled out a single tri-folded sheet of official municipal paper. I unfolded it slowly, ensuring the Coeur d'Alene Police Department letterhead was visible to everyone standing near us. "This is a formal incident report for Grand Theft Auto," I said, pitching my voice just loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear every deliberate syllable. "It details the events of 2 o'clock this morning when you and your former fiancé trespassed onto my property and stole a motor vehicle. It includes a reference number for the high-definition video footage I provided to the investigating officers." Vanessa recoiled. Her breath hitched. The air seemed to leave her lungs all at once. The knowledge that Ryan had abandoned her was already a heavy burden, but the realization that I held the power to send her to prison broke the final pillar of her arrogance. Her eyes widened, darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. "You have two choices, Vanessa," I continued, my tone devoid of any sibling affection. "You can turn around, walk out those glass doors, and never contact me again. Or you can remain in this gallery, and I will instruct Ms. Montgomery to dial emergency dispatch and have you arrested for felony theft in front of the local press. Choose right now." The silence in the warehouse was total. The wealthy patrons watched the exchange with unblinking focus. Vanessa's face contorted, cycling through rage denial and ultimate crushing humiliation. She looked at the elite guests, searching for a single sympathetic face to validate her victimhood. She found none. They stared at her with cold, polite disdain. The society she so desperately wanted to join was rejecting her like a failed tissue graft. Ms. Montgomery stepped forward, projecting the flawless authority of a seasoned executive. She did not raise her voice. She simply raised 2 fingers, signaling the uniformed security guards waiting near the coat check. "Escort these individuals off the premises," Montgomery instructed the guards, her tone clipped and decisive. "If they resist, contact the authorities immediately." The security personnel moved in, placing themselves between my family and the restored vintage layouts. Diane let out a muffled, pathetic sob, hiding her face behind her crumpled tissue as she turned away. Greg placed a heavy hand on Vanessa's arm, gently pulling her toward the exit. Vanessa resisted for a fraction of a second, her designer boots planted firmly on the concrete. She glared at me, delivering a final look of venomous defeat before she yielded to her stepfather's pull. They walked toward the glass doors, a slow, agonizing march of disgrace. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, sealing them out in the freezing mountain air. The gallery guests turned their attention back to the illuminated displays, the quiet murmurs of high society gossip resuming, as if the interruption had merely been a minor delay. The quiet demolition was complete. The false narrative was dismantled, leaving only the pristine truth of my father's legacy waiting for the auctioneer's gavel to fall the following morning. The morning sun filtered through the high industrial skylights of the Boise Gallery, casting long geometric shadows across the polished concrete floor. The tension from the previous night had dissipated, replaced by the electric, high-stakes energy of a global financial event. Rows of plush velvet chairs filled the main warehouse floor, occupied by private collectors and art dealers holding numbered paddles. To the left of the stage stood a long, elevated desk. A dozen gallery clerks sat shoulder to shoulder, wearing black headsets, managing open telephone lines with anonymous buyers from Tokyo, London, and Geneva. Above them, a large digital board displayed real-time currency conversions in euros, pounds, and yen. I stood in a private viewing alcove on the second-floor mezzanine. A pane of soundproof glass separated me from the bustling crowd below, allowing me to observe the proceedings in uninterrupted silence. I held a cup of black tea, letting the ceramic warmth seep into my palms. I looked down at the opulent room and thought of my father. I pictured him standing in his drafty garage, wearing his oil-stained canvas jacket, showing me how to measure the precise angles of a halftone rosette under a cheap magnifying glass. He had engineered this exact moment from that dusty workbench. At 10 o'clock sharp, Ms. Montgomery approached the wooden podium. She adjusted the microphone and commanded the attention of the room with a single, practiced look. She introduced the master lot. The high-definition monitors mounted on the brick walls flared to life, displaying the brilliant restored digital proofs of the 1960s graphic layouts and the iconic photographic portraits. "We will open the bidding for this historic collection at $1 million, Montgomery announced. Her voice was crisp and devoid of hesitation. A paddle went up in the third row. A phone clerk immediately raised a hand, signaling a counteroffer from an overseas buyer. The rhythm of the auction engaged. It was a structured algorithmic sequence, much like rendering a complex digital file. Each new bid added a layer of density to the final product. 1.2 million, Montgomery called. 1.5. The numbers on the digital currency board flipped rapidly. The local buyers in the velvet chairs quickly reached their financial limits and lowered their paddles. The contest migrated entirely to the bank of telephones. The price crossed the $2 million threshold. From my vantage point on the mezzanine, I could read the glowing screens of the clerk monitors below. A junior clerk, sitting near the edge of the desk, caught Montgomery's eye and raised his hand to signal a new bid. I focused on the clerk's terminal. The registered name associated with the incoming phone line displayed in stark white letters: Vanessa Gonzalez. I set my teacup down on the small table beside me. My sister was on the phone. She had survived the humiliation of her public ejection the night before and returned to execute a final desperate act of spite. To register for an international auction, a bidder must provide a substantial proof of funds or a verified corporate line of credit. Vanessa did not have cash. She had spent the last of her liquid inheritance weeks ago. But she still controlled the commercial accounts for her failing luxury boutique. She was leveraging the final remaining equity tied to the 40-acre timberland, pushing her corporate credit line to its absolute breaking point to secure a seat at the table. Her strategy was transparent and malicious. She did not want the vintage layouts. She knew the premarital provenance was bulletproof, and the art legally belonged to me. She was attempting to hijack the transaction. If she won the auction using leveraged debt, she could refuse to settle the final invoice. She would force a default, plunging the sale into a chaotic escrow dispute. She wanted to tie the assets up in endless commercial litigation, freezing the payout, so I would walk away with nothing. It was a kamikaze maneuver. She was willing to destroy her own financial standing just to watch me burn alongside her. 2.8 million, Montgomery announced, acknowledging Vanessa's clerk. A senior clerk managing a line to a private buyer in London raised his hand. 3 million. The bidding war narrowed to a fierce, rapid exchange between the anonymous London collector and my sister. The price climbed with dizzying speed. 3.2, 3.5. Vanessa was blindly pushing the numbers higher, fueled by a toxic combination of jealousy and rage. She was fighting a legitimate billionaire on the other side of the globe, using the fumes of a defaulted loan. 3.8 million, Montgomery called, pointing to the London clerk. Vanessa's clerk spoke into his headset, listening intently to the frantic voice on the other end of the line. He raised his hand. $4 million. A low murmur rippled through the audience seated on the warehouse floor. The sum had far exceeded the initial estimates. The London clerk typed a message to his client, waited 3 seconds, and raised his hand again with a definitive nod. 4.2 million, Montgomery declared. Her eyes shifted back to the edge of the desk. The room held its collective breath. Vanessa's clerk pressed his hand against his earpiece. He turned to his computer terminal to process the pre-authorization for a $4.3 million counterbid against the boutique corporate accounts. I watched the screen from the mezzanine. I knew the fragile architecture of her finances. The bank holding the commercial note on the timberland had been sending default warnings for weeks. The automated verification software initiated a real-time inquiry into her collateral. The screen flashed a distinct crimson error code. The transaction authorization failed. Her credit was tapped out. The bank had initiated formal foreclosure proceedings that very morning, permanently freezing her corporate lines. She had driven the price to astronomical heights, but the ceiling had just crashed down on her head. The clerk shook his head at Montgomery and lowered his hand. He pulled the headset away from his ear, distancing himself from whatever screaming response Vanessa was delivering through the phone. 4.2 million is bid, Montgomery announced, surveying the silent room. She paused, allowing the weight of the number to settle over the crowd. Fair warning, She raised the wooden auction block. The sharp, echoing crack of the wooden gavel hitting the sound block rang through the gallery. The sound was definitive. It was the mechanical period at the end of a long, arduous sentence. Sold for $4.2 million. The audience erupted into polite, appreciative applause. I stood in the quiet alcove, my hands resting on the cold glass partition. The adrenaline faded, leaving a profound, grounding clarity. My sister had attempted to sabotage the sale, and in doing so, she had accidentally enriched me immensely. Her spite had driven the final payout higher than I had ever anticipated, right up until the exact second her over-leveraged credit card was catastrophically declined. I looked down at the empty podium as the crowd began to disperse. The true genius of my father's gift finally washed over me. He did not leave me a simple cash deposit or a piece of real estate that could be easily contested by a greedy stepmother. He left me a complex structural puzzle. He secured his fortune inside a rusted shell, knowing the golden child would discard it without a second thought. He clouded the photographic plates, knowing the restoration required my specific intellect, my technical skill, and my quiet resilience. He built a fortress around my inheritance that naturally repelled the vultures in our family. He trusted me to uncover it, authenticate it, and protect it. I walked out of the viewing alcove and exited the gallery through a side door, stepping into the crisp Boise morning. The winter sun felt warm against my face. I drove back to Coeur d'Alene with the radio turned off, enjoying the steady hum of my tires against the highway. 7 days later, the international wire transfer cleared the escrow hold. I sat at my home workstation and watched the notification populate on my banking dashboard. The numbers on the screen were not just digits. They represented an impenetrable wall between my future and my family. They marked the true beginning of my independent life, funded by my father's foresight and secured by my own disciplined restraint. I closed the banking application and opened my digital design software, ready to accept a new freelance contract. I had won the war without ever raising my voice, but actions possess equal and opposite reactions. While I was securing my newfound independence, the shockwave of Vanessa's failed sabotage was tearing through the final supports of her curated life. The corporate credit rejection at the auction house had triggered a cascade of automated financial alerts. The grace periods had expired. The lenders were no longer interested in waiting. As I reviewed a new visual layout on my monitor, a bank agent was standing on the front porch of my sister's 4-bedroom estate, holding a roll of neon orange tape and a stack of legal eviction notices. The story of the golden child was reaching its inevitable crushing conclusion. The financial impact of a rejected corporate credit transaction does not remain isolated to a single declined purchase. It functions like a structural fracture in a load-bearing wall. Once that primary support fails, the subsequent collapse is rapid, undeniable, and impossible to hide. My sister had built her entire life upon leveraged debt, using the illusion of wealth to secure further lines of credit. When the auction house terminal flashed that crimson error code, it sent an automated signal across the banking network. The lenders stopped waiting. 14 days after the auction funds cleared into my secure accounts, I drove my compact sedan across town to visit the neighborhood where I grew up. I did not go to gloat. I went to verify the data. In my profession, you do not trust rumors. You look for empirical proof. I parked across the street from the sprawling 4-bedroom estate my biological father had built. The manicured lawn, once a pristine carpet of green, had already begun to turn a brittle, neglected yellow. The automatic sprinkler system had been shut off to save money on utility bills. Weeds pushed through the cracks in the decorative paver driveway. The physical decay of the property mirrored the internal rot of the people living inside it. I rolled down my window, letting the crisp mountain breeze drift into the car. My eyes tracked the geometry of the front porch. Affixed directly to the center of the heavy oak front door was a bright neon orange notice. The adhesive sticker bore bold black lettering that read, "Bank-owned property. no trespassing. Vanessa had treated the inherited estate like an endless automated teller machine. She extracted the equity through high-interest loans to fund her doomed luxury boutique, assuming the cash flow would magically manifest to cover the premiums. When her retail storefront failed, the commercial notes defaulted. The bank did not care about her curated social media presence or her loud entitlement. They cared about the ledger. They executed a swift clinical foreclosure, seizing the house and locking her out. The golden child fled the wreckage she had created. Without Ryan to fund her illusions, and with her credit score reduced to ash, she vanished from the public eye. She abandoned the responsibilities of the estate, leaving the fallout squarely on the shoulders of the two people who had enabled her worst impulses for decades. Diane and Greg could not escape the blast radius. They had co-signed the commercial leases for the boutique. They had guaranteed the loans to protect their daughter from the consequences of her own incompetence. To satisfy the circling creditors and avoid personal bankruptcy, my mother and stepfather were forced to liquidate their entire safety net. Greg surrendered his pension. Diane drained the savings accounts she had guarded so fiercely. I put my car in gear and drove toward the industrial edge of Coeur d'Alene, navigating away from the wealthy subdivisions. I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a faded, low-rise apartment complex. The stucco siding of the building was peeling in large, dry flakes. A chain-link fence separated the property from a noisy commercial freight route. Through the windshield, I watched Greg struggle to carry a cheap particle board television stand up a narrow flight of concrete stairs. His shoulders sagged under the weight. His face looked hollow, drained of the smug superiority he had worn like a uniform during the estate reading. Diane walked behind him, carrying a cardboard box filled with kitchen supplies. She did not look around. She kept her eyes fixed on the dirty concrete steps, her posture rigid, with a brittle, defensive shame. They had traded a sprawling four-bedroom home for a cramped, drafty apartment overlooking a shipping lane. The wealth they had inherited, freely and flaunted so cruelly, was entirely gone in less than a year. They had nothing to show for it but bitterness and back pain. I watched them disappear into the dim hallway of the complex. I felt no pity. I felt no guilt. When you evaluate a visual layout, you look at the relationship between the foreground elements and the background canvas. If the primary subject lacks inherent brightness or contrast, amateur designers will artificially darken the surrounding layers to force the subject to pop. My family had treated me as that dark background layer. They required my projected failure and my quiet subservience to make Vanessa's unearned success look brilliant. They did not just want the money my father left behind. They wanted me to bow. They needed me to remain the broken, dramatic sister sitting in a rusted truck, because without the contrast of my defeat, the glaring flaws in their own composition became undeniable. When I refused to play the dark background when I walked away and secured my own independent fortune, their illusion lost its contrast. They destroyed their own lives trying to force me back into the shadows, but the final piece of the estate still lingered in legal limbo. The 40 acres of pristine Idaho timberland had also been leveraged in Vanessa's failed business ventures. Unlike the residential home, the commercial lenders did not want the burden of managing raw, undeveloped acreage. The property taxes went unpaid. After the statutory delinquency period expired, the county seized the title. The state announced a public tax deed auction to liquidate the timberland and recover the owed municipal revenue. I did not attend the auction in person. Showing my face at the county courthouse steps would invite unnecessary scrutiny and potentially attract the attention of local journalists looking for a human interest story. I prefer to operate from behind a secure, structured interface. I hired an independent registered agent to form a blind, limited liability company on my behalf. I named the corporate entity Silver Gelatin Holdings, a quiet homage to the vintage photographic plates that had funded my new life. I transferred a fraction of my secure auction proceeds into the corporate escrow account. On a quiet Thursday morning, I sat at my home workstation sipping black tea while monitoring the county's digital bidding portal. The interface was stark and utilitarian, displaying parcel numbers and minimum bid requirements. It was a cold, factual environment, devoid of emotion or theatricality. The 40-acre parcel appeared on the screen. The starting bid covered merely the back taxes and the county administrative fees. A few local developers logged small, incremental offers, hoping to secure the timber rights for a steep discount. I waited until the final 30 seconds of the digital auction window. I executed a preemptive sweeping bid that surpassed the developer's maximum thresholds by a significant margin. The number was substantial enough to instantly kill any counteroffers, yet it represented less than 5% of my total liquid assets. The digital timer ticked down to 0. The screen refreshed, flashing a stark green banner confirming the transaction. Silver Gelatin Holdings was the prevailing bidder. The county issued a clear, unencumbered deed to my corporate proxy. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair and looked out my office window. The sheer poetic justice of the transaction settled over me like a warm blanket. The sprawling acreage of towering pines and quiet mountain streams, the very land my sister had used as a prop in her social media photographs to mock my rusted truck, was now legally mine. She had posed on that soil feeling like a queen, and now I held the title to the dirt beneath her boots. I spent the next few weeks setting up my new life. I signed a lease on a secure private commercial studio to house my expanding digital archiving firm. I established unbreachable boundaries between my personal assets and the public record. My routine was peaceful, structured, and entirely under my own control. But narcissists do not comprehend boundaries. They view silence as a challenge rather than a conclusion. They believe that any bridge they have burned can simply be rebuilt with tears and demands. I returned to my studio one afternoon after a meeting with a new high-profile client. I walked into the reception area and checked my secure business mailbox. Amidst the stack of crisp vendor invoices and professional correspondence, a single jarring anomaly rested at the bottom of the pile. It was a wrinkled, pale yellow envelope. The postage stamp was crooked. The return address was blank, but the handwriting, sprawling across the center, was unmistakable. It was the frantic, uneven cursive of my mother. They had exhausted their bank accounts, alienated their allies, and destroyed their credit. Now they were shifting to their final, desperate tactic. The quiet peace of my new empire was about to be tested by a ghost from the rubble. The morning sun warmed the polished hardwood floors of my new commercial studio. I had designed this workspace to reflect my professional ethos. Everything possessed a clear purpose. The high-resolution monitors sat mounted on ergonomic aluminum arms. The encrypted data servers hummed quietly in a climate-controlled glass enclosure. The air smelled of roasted espresso beans and clean ozone. It was a sanctuary of order, logic, and verifiable truth. My business was thriving, my reputation secured by the flawless authentication of the vintage photographic plates. I had constructed a fortress of independence. Then I walked out to the reception area to check the daily correspondence. My secure post office box receives mail forwarded through a registered corporate agent, a system engineered to maintain strict privacy. Amidst the neat stack of printed vendor invoices and formal client contracts, a glaring anomaly rested at the bottom of the pile. It was a wrinkled, pale yellow envelope. The paper quality was cheap, the edges frayed and bent from transit. The return address field was conspicuously blank. A single crooked postage stamp sat in the upper right corner. The handwriting sprawling across the center was an unmistakable artifact from my past. The cursive loops were overly large, leaning heavily to the right, pressing so deeply into the paper that the ink bled through the cheap fibers. It was the frantic, uneven script of my mother. They had exhausted their bank accounts. They had alienated their local allies. They had destroyed their own credit ratings through leveraged debt and failed retail ventures. Now living in a cramped apartment overlooking a noisy freight route, they were shifting to their final tactic. They could no longer afford attorneys or forged towing documents. They could only afford the price of a single postage stamp. I carried the yellow envelope back to my desk. I did not open it immediately. I noticed a blinking red indicator light on my voice-over Internet Protocol desk phone. The localized caller identification number matched a cheap prepaid mobile device. I pressed the speaker button, letting the audio fill the quiet room. A ragged inhalation hissed through the high-fidelity drivers. Then came the voice. Vanessa sounded small, stripped of the polished arrogance she wore like a protective shell during our standoff at the Boise Gallery. She wept directly into the microphone. The audio was distorted by her tears and the cheap cellular connection. She spun a convoluted tale of profound victimhood, detailing how the universe had conspired against her success. She blamed the commercial lenders for being greedy. She blamed the local economy for the failure of her luxury boutique. She blamed Ryan for abandoning her when the foreclosure notices arrived. She painted herself as a tragic protagonist, suffering unjust persecution from a cruel world. At no point in the 2-minute recording did she mention the stolen flatbed tow truck. She omitted the midnight trespassing. She conveniently forgot the fraudulent legal injunctions she had filed to freeze my assets. She sobbed, asking why her life had to be so exceptionally unfair. She cried about feeling lost and broken, stating she just wanted her family back. She wanted a savior to swoop down and fix the fractured architecture of her consequences. I listened to the entire message. My heart rate remained at a steady, resting rhythm. The emotional performance held zero traction. I analyzed the audio the same way I evaluate a poorly constructed digital layout. It lacked underlying substance. It was pure noise designed to distract the listener from the absence of genuine accountability. I pressed the delete key, wiping the file from the server permanently. I picked up a heavy brass letter opener from my desk and sliced the seal of the yellow envelope. A folded sheet of stationery slid out, carrying the faint, cloying scent of Diane's signature floral perfume. The aroma used to trigger an immediate conditioned spike of anxiety in my chest. Today, it just smelled like outdated chemicals. I unfolded the page and flattened it under the crisp, white glow of my LED desk lamp. I read the paragraphs using a detached, critical framework. When you evaluate a visual composition, you look for the underlying intent. A competent graphic designer uses negative space and structured typography to guide the viewer toward a central, honest message. A manipulator uses emotional static to obscure their true objective. Diane filled the top half of the page with meandering paragraphs about forgiveness, spiritual growth, and unbreakable biological bonds. She used the word family 7 times in 3 short sentences. She wrote about how grief makes people act out of character. She was attempting to reframe their calculated greed as temporary emotional instability. She utilized plural pronouns to diffuse the guilt, writing that we all made mistakes and we all need to heal. I did not share their mistakes. I rejected the shared blame. The actual demand, the true focal point of the deceptive layout, was buried deep in the 3rd paragraph. Diane requested a favor. She suggested that, given my recent financial triumphs, I possessed the unique opportunity to restore our fractured dynamic. She wanted me to contact the commercial bank holding the foreclosure deed on the 4-bedroom estate my biological father had built. She asked me to purchase the luxury property outright with cash. The audacity escalated further. Once I purchased the estate, she requested that I allow Vanessa to move back into the house without a lease or any rent obligation. Diane pitched this absurd scenario as a noble pathway to redemption, claiming it would bring peace to my father's memory and prove my maturity. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. The sheer scale of their entitlement was breathtaking. They had tried to steal my inheritance in the middle of the night. They had caused a public spectacle designed to ruin my professional reputation in front of elite art collectors. Now, facing the bleak reality of poverty, they expected me to purchase a massive home for the very person who orchestrated the abuse. They were not offering an apology. They were offering me the privilege of funding their lifestyle. They were not sorry for how they treated me. They were only sorry that they lost the game. To engage with the letter would be a critical failure. If I called Diane to decline the outrageous request, she would view the interaction as a successful breach of my boundaries. She would twist my refusal into another dramatic narrative, casting me as the cruel, wealthy sister, ignoring her destitute relatives. If I mail the written response outlining their hypocrisy, they would use the letter as proof that I still cared enough to argue. A response is a transaction, and I refused to pay their emotional toll. Silence is the ultimate shield against a narcissist. It deprives them of the friction they need to generate their false realities. I picked up the pale yellow page. I walked across the polished hardwood floor of my studio toward the heavy-duty commercial paper shredder resting in the corner. The machine was designed to destroy sensitive corporate documents and thick plastic credit cards. I engaged the power switch. The internal steel blades hummed to life with a low, hungry vibration. I held the edge of the stationery over the feeding slot. I did not feel a lingering sense of loss or a sudden pang of familial guilt. I felt the crisp, clinical satisfaction of a completed project. I released the paper. The machine grabbed the document, pulling it downward in a swift, decisive motion. The mechanical teeth chewed the cursive handwriting, the fake tears, and the audacious demands into hundreds of illegible, fragmented strips. The paper dust settled into the collection bin below. The manipulation vanished. I turned off the machine. The quiet hum of my data servers filled the room once again. I had finally severed the cord. The fortress I had built was secure, fortified against any remaining echoes of their toxic entitlement. The past was shredded, and the future belonged entirely to me. 3 years shifted the landscape of my life. Time is a reliable filter, separating the structural pillars of a foundation from the superficial debris resting on the surface. I took the capital from the Boise Gallery auction and invested it with calculated precision. I did not purchase a sprawling residential estate to showcase my newfound status. I did not buy a fleet of depreciating luxury vehicles or post filtered photographs of my bank statements. Wealth that requires an audience is inherently fragile. True independence operates in silence. I established my own digital archiving and visual analysis firm in downtown Coeur d'Alene. My studio evolved from a single room into an elite, highly specialized agency occupying an entire floor of a renovated commercial building. We cater to international museums, private historical trusts, and high-net-worth estates. My team performs the exact forensic work my father taught me in his drafty garage. We resurrect degraded media. We authenticate provenance. We strip away the noise to reveal the underlying truth. The puzzle he left in the floorboards of that old truck became the blueprint for an entire empire. The boundary I established on the day I shredded my mother's letter held firm. I never spoke to Diane Gregg or Vanessa again. I changed my personal phone numbers and instructed my corporate reception desk to decline any unscheduled visitors. They became ghosts, relegated to the outer margins of my existence. But small mountain towns possess their own internal communication networks. Information drifts through the community like pine pollen on the wind. I occasionally heard updates through local vendors or passing acquaintances. The details were a predictable study in consequence. Vanessa did not experience a miraculous redemption. The loss of her inherited wealth and her foreclosed boutique stripped away her curated identity. She secured a position at a mid-tier retail clothing store in the local outdoor mall. She spent her shifts folding sweaters and standing behind a cash register for minimum wage. According to the rumors, she remained a dedicated performer. She complained incessantly to her coworkers and captive customers about the great injustice of her life. She spun elaborate fictional tales about a ruthless older sister who manipulated a legal loophole to steal her rightful inheritance. She clung to the narrative of victimhood because acknowledging the truth would require her to accept her own profound failures. I listened to these updates without a trace of anger or resentment. I felt a detached, clinical indifference. She was a fading echo from a closed chapter. I did not care what lies she broadcasted to strangers holding shopping bags. The people who matter do not listen to volume. They look at the results. To honor the man who taught me the value of quiet observation, I dedicated a fraction of the auction funds to a deeply personal project. I did not sell the rusted 1974 Ford F250 to a scrapyard. I hired the premier automotive restoration shop in the Pacific Northwest and handed them the keys along with a mandate for uncompromising historical accuracy. The physical transformation required 8 months of meticulous labor. The technicians stripped the heavy chassis down to the bare metal. They eradicated every trace of corrosive rust and dry rot. They rebuilt the paralyzed engine block, replacing the compromised internal components with forged steel and polished aluminum. They sanded the exterior panels until they were flawlessly smooth, painting the truck in its original factory-designated shade of deep forest green. The chrome bumpers were polished until they mirrored the surrounding landscape. The interior cab received the same rigorous attention. The cracked vinyl bench seat was reupholstered in durable, period-correct saddle leather. The brittle rubber floor matting was discarded, replaced by heavy-duty woven carpets. The dashboard instrumentation glowed with sharp, revitalized clarity. But I instructed the restoration team to retain one specific structural modification. The custom-welded titanium lockbox remained bolted directly to the passenger side floor pan. The watertight seals were replaced, and the mechanical keypad was cleaned and lubricated. The vault no longer housed a multi-million-dollar collection of 1960s graphic layouts and photographic plates. I repurposed the hidden chamber. It now holds practical, essential tools for mountain driving: heavy thermal blankets, a comprehensive first aid kit, high-lumen emergency flares, and a durable set of socket wrenches sits securely inside the foam cradle. It is a pragmatic use for a space that once held a secret, a quiet nod to my father's inventive engineering. On crisp Saturday mornings before the city wakes, I walk out to my driveway and slide behind the heavy steering wheel of the restored Ford. The brass key, now polished and free of oxidized grime, slides smoothly into the ignition. I turn the cylinder. The rebuilt engine catches instantly. The smooth, resonant hum of the customized exhaust reverberates through the quiet neighborhood. It is not the ragged, choking sputter of a dying machine. It is the steady, powerful rhythm of a foundation operating at peak efficiency. I shift the transmission into gear and drive out of the city limits. I guide the heavy truck up the winding 2-lane asphalt roads that carve through the rugged Idaho mountains. The suspension glides over the uneven terrain, absorbing the impact with engineered grace. I roll the windows down, letting the freezing pine-scented air rush through the cabin. My destination is always the same. I turn off the main highway onto a secluded gravel access road. The tires crunch against the loose stone, kicking up small clouds of white dust. I park the truck near the edge of a deep, ancient ravine. I step out of the cab and stand on the soil. This is the 40-acre parcel of pristine timberland, the same sprawling acreage my sister once used as a prop in her social media photographs to mock my rusted truck. The same land she leveraged into bankruptcy to fund her hollow illusions. When the county seized the property for unpaid taxes, my corporate proxy, Silver Gelatin Holdings, purchased the unencumbered deed at auction. I own the trees. I own the streams. I own the dirt she stood on when she tried to mock my worth. I walk through the dense canopy of evergreens, listening to the wind filter through the high branches. The sunlight dapples the forest floor, creating intricate shifting patterns of light and shadow. I do not plan to develop the acreage. I do not intend to clear the timber or build a sprawling residential compound to signal my success to passing strangers. I am placing the land into a perpetual conservation trust. It will remain wild, untamed, and perfectly secure. I stand near the edge of the creek, watching the clear, freezing water rush over the smooth stones. I am a self-made woman who took the family trash and turned it into an empire. I did not achieve my independence by screaming the loudest or demanding the most attention. I achieved it through strategic patience, rigorous intellect, and the steadfast refusal to participate in manufactured drama. When people attempt to hand you their broken pieces and demand that you carry the weight of their failures, you possess the power to decline the transaction. You do not have to accept the rusted key or the heavy burden of their expectations. You can analyze the structure of the conflict, identify the hidden leverage, and quietly engineer your own escape. The people who rely on theatrical manipulation will always collapse under the weight of their own noise. They build houses out of paper and complain when the wind blows. My foundation is forged from different materials. It is built on the empirical verification of facts, the disciplined application of skill, and the profound peace of genuine independence. I walk back to the forest green truck, resting under the canopy of the pines. I run my hand along the smooth, polished steel of the hood. The metal is cool and resilient. I climb into the cab, start the engine, and drive back down the mountain. The truth does not need volume. It just needs someone willing to do the quiet, unyielding work of uncovering it.